In today's lecture, we will develop the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to explain macroeconomic phenomenon, especially recessions, and also how the changes in GDP has its effects on unemployment, investments, and prices. To develop the model, first let's talk about the supply, which is aggregate supply. So here's a definition of aggregate supply. So aggregate supply shows the quantity of goods and services that firms choose to produce and sell at each price level. So basically you look at the average price in the economy and you figure out how much firms are willing to sell at that average price. Now, economy do consist of millions of firms. So here we are talking about total supply at an aggregate level or at the macroeconomic level. We are not talking separately about supply of potatoes or supply of apples or supply of oranges or supply of movie tickets. We are talking about total supply in the economy. So first let me draw a supply curve. To draw a supply curve, like any demand and supply, there has to be a price. So what we measure on the horizontal axis is output, which are GDP in billions of dollar, and what we measure here is average price, which is also called CPI, or you can say average price index. So what we are measuring here, the aggregate price in the economy, and we can always label it here. Maybe it's, say, starting with 0 is 1000, is 2000, is 3000, is 4000, and price level, as it is an index, it will start, say, at 10, 20, 50, 100, 150. So you can just put numbers. So higher the it goes up here, it means increasing price, increasing GDP. So GDP increases as we move towards the right. A typical aggregate supply would look like something like this. So a typical aggregate supply curve shaped up like this. That's your aggregate supply. And for example, at the 1000 unit, you might have here 12, and you may have here 18, and so on. So each point represent, maybe that's 50. Now why this is shaped, why it is flatter and then it's very steep, we'll explain this in a bit. So here's the thing. So aggregate supply slopes up because the price level for outputs rises with the price of inputs remaining fixed. Firms have an incentive to produce more to earn higher profits, also called short-run aggregate supply. So this is also known as short-run aggregate supply, or let me write it down, short-run aggregate supply. Again, this is the total price, assuming input prices are fixed. What firms see is a higher profitability. When prices go up, they are selling at higher price, and if profit increases, you want to sell more, you want to produce more. As a result, production increases. So total supply in the economy increases as price level increases. Another concept that I would like to introduce to you is the concept of potential GDP. Now, what is a potential GDP? So potential GDP shows the maximum that the economy can produce with full employment of workers and physical capital. It's also called long-run aggregate supply. So potential GDP is an ideal situation. Assume that the maximum a country can produce if we are utilizing our resources to the fullest extent possible, which means that we are utilizing all the labor force we have, we are utilizing all the resources we have. That's the maximum we can do. And how do we show a potential GDP? Potential GDP is shown as a vertical line. And let me show you this. So this is your potential GDP line, also called long run aggregate supply. So our potential GDP might be at this point at around, say, $5,000 billion. So potential GDP, you can imagine, is the maximum that we can produce in a country. That's the idea behind the potential GDP. Next, let's take up aggregate demand curve. And what does this aggregate demand curve means? Aggregate demand curve shows the quantity of goods and services that households, firms, and government want to buy at each price level. So given a price level, the question you are asking, how much we want to buy, or how much people or everybody in this country wants to buy. We know from our previous lectures on GDP, when we measure GDP, we can measure GDP from the expenditure side. So here's the fun thing. So four components of GDP contribute to the aggregate demand for goods and services, which are C plus I plus G plus NX, which is equal to aggregate demand, which is also equal to your GDP or Y in equilibrium. So it's a funny thing. So GDP is nothing but the summation of total goods and services demanded. And who demand goods and services? Is people like you and me through consumption, people who want to invest, build a factory through investment, our government to spend money, they demand resources, and finally the net exports, which is the exports minus imports. So aggregate demand in equilibrium is the same thing as GDP. So four components of aggregate demand are C plus I plus G plus NX. So let's now try to draw a aggregate demand curve. We'll do the same thing. We'll first draw this is again output, which is also Y in real billion of dollar. We measure aggregate price level, which is CPI. Again, we can start from 0. We can start from here, let's say 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and 5,000. And we can put prices here: 10, 20, 50, 100, 150. And demand curve typically slopes downward. So that's aggregate demand. And why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward? And here's the reasoning. Aggregate demand slopes down, showing that as the price level rises, the amount of total spending on the domestic goods and services declines. So which means that as prices increases, people spend less money. Now here's the problem. Problem is this: prices have no meaning in macroeconomics. When prices go up, so does people's income also increases. So how do, if prices increases, aggregate demand decreases? And there are three reasons behind it. And here are the three reasons why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. First is wealth effect. Wealth effect shows the relationship between price and consumption. So as price increases, real wealth decreases. Why real wealth decreases? Because as price increases, suddenly you realize that, say you have $5,000 in a bank account, your money can't buy enough, so real value of the wealth decreases, which means that you feel less wealthy. If you feel less wealthy, your consumption decreases. As consumption decreases, your aggregate demand decreases. So price increase lead to decrease in real wealth, which lead to decrease in consumption, which leads to decrease in aggregate demand. And that's the reason why there's an inverse relationship in price increase and consumption and aggregate demand. It's called the wealth effect. Then there's the interest rate effect. It's the relationship between price level and investment. And here it goes. As price increases, we all know nominal interest rate increases. As price increases, nominal interest rate increases. Now, as why nominal interest rate increases? Remember when we did savings, we talked about how increase in prices leads to increased interest rate. So when interest rate increases, your cost of borrowing increases. If cost of borrowing increases, you don't want to borrow money to build a new factory, so your investment decreases, and as investment decreases, your aggregate demand decreases. So this is called the interest rate effect. So interest rate effect, again showing the inverse relationship between price and aggregate demand. Finally, we have the exchange rate effect. It shows the relationship between price level and net exports. And here's the logic and reasoning. As price increases, nominal interest rate increases, which leads to domestic currency appreciate. That means domestic currency becomes more valuable and foreign currency depreciate, or together exchange rate increases. As exchange rate increases, your exports decrease, your imports increase. And why exports decrease and imports increase? Mind you, for us, our money now can buy more because dollar appreciated, so we can go out to other countries and buy a lot of their stuff. On the other hand, for foreigners, it's very expensive to buy US dollars because their currency depreciated, so they'll be buying less from us. So when they buy less from us, we are exporting less, but when we buy more from the rest of the world, we are importing more, which means that net exports decreases, which means that aggregate demand decreases. So this is the logic behind the exchange rate effect, which connects up prices through interest rate, exchange rate, and aggregate demand. Again, an inverse relationship between price here and aggregate demand here. So all these three factors work together to show that aggregate demand overall slopes downward, which is basically means an inverse relationship between price level and total quantity demanded in the economy. What I'm going to do next is to show you an equilibrium using an aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and long run aggregate supply. So let's draw it again. So I just put here price level. I just put Y as GDP. Okay, so I'm going to start using short forms. Y means total output or GDP. This is your short run aggregate supply. This is your long run aggregate supply, and say this is your aggregate demand. And wherever aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply intersects, that's your equilibrium. So the term we use is equilibrium. That gives you the equilibrium GDP, which may be say $4,000. Mind you, potential is 5,000, and this gives you say price level, say 50, whatever number you want to put. So what it shows that in this economy, wherever short-term aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersects, That's the short run equilibrium. So this equilibrium is also called short run equilibrium. So here's the bottom line. The intersection of aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve shows the equilibrium level of real GDP and equilibrium price level in the economy. Now what I'm going to help you to understand is short run versus long run equilibrium. And what's the difference? So first let's do the long run equilibrium. So I'll draw it here again. This is your price, this is your Y. Draw an aggregate supply, or rather short run aggregate supply, a long run aggregate supply. We draw it. So when these three curves intersects together, that's a long run equilibrium. So long run equilibrium is any point where short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply are intersecting together. So in the long run, all these three curves, AD, SRAS and LRAS, intersect at the same point. Now what is a short run equilibrium? So this is your short run equilibrium. So short run equilibrium happens of the long run aggregate supply. That means in the short run, the three curves, that is short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply, do not intersect together. So it only happens of the long run aggregate supply, which is the intersection between short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So these distinctions are very important as we move on. Always remember, in an economy, what we are aiming for is to reach the long run aggregate supply. That's what our potential is. That's also called the potential GDP. That means how much we can potentially produce. So this long run, this is a long run, this is short run. In the short run, we can be off the long run aggregate supply, but in the long run we have to be on this long run aggregate supply, because that's what we are aiming for.